Hi everybody. So my talk is about creating awesome user experiences with observables. As he mentioned, my name is Feather Knee, and yes, that is my real name. And I'm a senior UI developer at NVIDIA. My Twitter handle is FeatherArt, and you can reach out to me through Twitter. You can also just talk to me. I'm pretty friendly, so yeah. So my goals today is to impart a conceptual understanding of observables and streams, give you some practical applications for those things, and also go into some kind of implementation variations. So my motivation for this talk is kind of twofold. One of them comes from my background as an artist. So this is actually one of my paintings. It's a painting of a reflection in a stream, and this is how I originally saw it, which is upside down. And most people would see this painting and they'd say, why don't you put it the right side up? And this was kind of a thing I always enjoyed as an artist, was kind of interacting with people, and I think this is what's really sort of taken me from flat paintings to the web, is that sense of interaction. I find that really fascinating. And one of the things that I love about observables is it gives you this kind of whole other medium to be interactive with your users. So my other motivation for this talk is that I feel like a lot of really smart people are very put off by the whole concept of observables. They're just kind of intimidated by it. And I think it can be really intimidating if you kind of dive into implementation first. But if you think about it just in terms of kind of the concept of observables, then you kind of slide into implementation. It just makes a lot more sense. So that's what we're going to try to do today. So basically, and there's going to be a lot of goats, so just know that ahead of hand. So basically, an observable is when a thing is watching another thing. It's really that simple. So I'm going to tell you a story of observables in the wild. Suppose one day you're hiking in the Alps, because that's just the kind of person you are. You hike in the Alps, and you stop to eat lunch. You have an apple with you. You give one apple core to one goat. And then you just keep hiking, and later on you turn around, and there's 50 goats following you. This actually happened to me one time, by the way. So this is the formal definition, and don't get too hung up on that, but kind of what I want you to know is that an observable is kind of a design pattern. It's been with us for a long time. Design patterns, for those of you who weren't doing software in the 90s, is kind of like a template. It's like a way of doing a thing that you do often in software. So observable is kind of a two-part pattern. It's an observer and a subject. And you can think of the subject as kind of like a speaker, and the observer is like an ear. And so with my goat example, the subject is you, and the observers would be the goats. So goats are very observant. So what does that have to do with streams? I don't know who did this to their goat, but I just love this photo. So a stream can be a lot of things. It could be a series of observations. It could be a series of events, a collection of data points. And so you're kind of probably wondering now, like, how are those two things connected? I don't know how this goat did that either. So if you think about like movies, so a movie is kind of like a series of events that happens over time. It's continuous. Whereas if you think about like a snapshot, it's just one point in time. So now that we understand streams, let's begin to talk a little bit about collections. Oh, actually, sorry. Yeah, series of events in a UI or a series of data points. So collections are kind of like arrays. So it's kind of like if you have a thing that's observing another thing, it's collecting all these data points. And it just kind of forms this sort of more loose assortment. So it's kind of like an array, but it's a little bit more informal. But you use all these kind of like array-like operators with collections. And I know at this point you're probably saying to yourself, like, oh, this is really cool, Feather, but why are you telling me this? And basically, I feel like it's great to have kind of like cool technology, but at the end of the day, it all has to come down to creating awesome user experiences, especially as front-end developers. I know we love to kind of like immerse ourselves in the tech, but really for me, it's kind of like get back to that interactivity, that sense of delight and wonder that we can create in people that are using our stuff. So some of my design goals when I'm kind of like thinking about implementing something is sort of making it more simple for people, fewer steps to complete a process. So I love observables because they give you these things like actions, or there's no submit button. And that was kind of like the first thing that got me about RxJS. I saw this input where you just would type into the input and things would happen. This was a while ago, by the way. And I remember thinking, but where's the submit button? And it wasn't there. And I was like, oh, that's really cool. And so I really love this kind of like reactive behavior. And it's actually kind of like a whole school of thinking around design called anticipatory design. And they're kind of like these user-centric patterns that try to anticipate your user's needs. So it's basically, you can think of it as like user flows without speed bumps. And it's all kind of going towards a smooth transaction. This, by the way, is goat yoga, which I've never tried before, but I love goats and I love yoga, so I feel like it's calling my name. So a fun fact about anticipatory design is that it's also very connected with data science, which if any of you saw my talk last year, you know that's a thing I'm super passionate about. So as you're browsing the web, kind of like you're the subject, and the internet is the observer. So let's talk about the stream types again. So as we mentioned earlier, a stream can be a series of things that a user is doing with a website. Could be, and this is very fluid, like it's the things that we typically do, mouse clicks, keystrokes. As we just saw earlier, sometimes the mouse is not available, so it could be other things. I think voice is a really fun thing to play with. I love playing with the speech synthesis API. There's also values, so that's streaming data. And there's different types of libraries that kind of work with these types of observables. So there's the RxJS is kind of the granddaddy of them all. And then there's Bacon and Kefir, which just makes me really hungry when I think about it. And then there's kind of like the more value-driven ones that are like MobX and Redux Observable. And I forgot this one spends. So Redux for 3 ducks. Yeah, anyway. So streaming data is basically data that arrives as a stream. And so I think, like, do any of you work with streaming data on a daily basis? I see like 2 hands. Yeah, so I think most of us work with like REST endpoints, and we kind of have that familiar experience where you go and you request some data and you kind of get this little chunk of data, and then that's the transaction. And so these other types of endpoints that you can hit will give you just kind of like an on switch where you're turning on that flow of data and it's just kind of coming, and it's sort of like a fire hose type situation. So it's a little different. And the same thing happens with events. So you know, as a user is interacting with whatever website you have, there's just kind of a series of things that come in, like data points, as that user is moving around and navigating. And those are also streams. And there's a lot of different ways to deal with that. Today we're going to talk a lot about RxJS, but we also have like a surprise guest, because as I was writing this talk, I learned some things about React that I'll go into later, that I'm just going to tease you a little bit right now. So RxJS is a little bit intimidating at first. How many of you ever played with RxJS at all? I'm just curious. Okay, so that was a fair showing. So I don't know about you, but like the first time I kind of just saw all the operators, I was just like, oh my God, that's a lot of operators. So if you can, if you think about it, sorry, I make stupid jokes all the time, if you haven't noticed. So if you think about these operators in terms of streams, I think it makes a lot more sense. So like if you have a couple streams, a switch map, so remember it has that kind of like map-like analogy. A switch map will just take only the latest stream. A merge map will take all the streams, and a concat map will take all of the things, but it has to be in order. So here are some common uses of these things. Type-ahead search, password verification, and drag and drop. So a type-ahead search, you probably have all encountered this a lot of times. Basically, it's just kind of listening for users' keystrokes, and it will live update results as the person is typing. And usually these results are returned asynchronously. So there's a couple things you have to think about, like if you have a person who's kind of typing and then they type really quickly and then they backspace a lot, it's going to send out just a ton of network requests. So you want to sort of like handle that, usually by debouncing those network requests, just kind of only have a certain number of requests go out of all the things that they type. You also want to handle like a loading state, because you're getting your data asynchronously, so you know that there's going to be a little bit of time waiting for that. And you want to be able to handle when there's no results that come back. And it's possible to do this with just JavaScript. A lot of people have done this, just kind of straight up JavaScript, type-aheads. It's a little bit complicated. It's totally doable. You have an input, you have handlers to listen for updates, you have a loading state handler, and you have a debounce mechanism, which you can just kind of roll your own. It does get kind of complicated, however. These are actual goats who live in trees, by the way. How cool is that? So with RxJS, this is actually really simple. You have your input and you kind of wrap it in an observable stream. And that switch map operator that we talked about just takes the most recent thing. So it kind of just, everything that's not useful anymore, it just like throws it out. And it has all these built-in operators for dealing with debouncing, which are very nice, and loading states. So I'm just going to show you kind of a little demo of this that I wrote. And this is searching the GitHub API. And it's only looking for images, because I just care about images. And it has like a pretty simple loading state. It doesn't really handle no results, so it's very simple. So of course the first thing I did was just look up myself, and I also wrote like a weird loading state. So yeah, it's me, right? Actually, that's not me. There I am. That's me. That is actually me. But you can see I didn't actually handle no results, so you can just see the network kind of just turning red there in the network tab. This is a recording, by the way. I wasn't going to do this live. I mean, I'm not crazy. But anyway, so you can see the switch map there working. It's just kind of taking the latest of whatever is being piped in. And when you look at kind of like RxJS in operation and action, you see all these things that look very stream-like pipes and tap. And it all makes a lot of sense when you kind of understand the stream part. So yeah, there's the pipe. And this actually, this code snippet here, all of it is using Recompose with React. And so our code base at work relies pretty heavily on Recompose. And I remember kind of like learning about hooks and thinking, oh, I don't think Recompose is going to be a thing much longer. And it turns out I was kind of right about that. So I got to thinking, what about hooks? And realized that I could kind of like do a lot of what I was doing already with RxJS, just using hooks and not using Recompose. So there's a lot of options here. You can just kind of like use your own, use observables, hooks. That integration is actually pretty simple. You can also use this, there's an open source library called RxJS Hooks that's pretty fun. And I feel like that kind of makes it a little bit more accessible if you're just getting your feet wet. So I decided to build another demo. This time I'm searching the XKCD API. How many of you know this cartoon? Okay, yes, we're nerds. All right, we all know this. So it's still only one response at a time, images, simple loading state, my little rainbow roller thingy. And the XKCD API is just numbers, so you just type in numbers and a random cartoon comes up. And so it's pretty similar. It's a similar type of situation, different API and different technology. The code itself is very different. So we're going to dive into that. And actually, when I first started writing this, I thought, I'm just going to use RxJS with kind of like a hooks situation. And I started writing it, and then like a few hours later, I realized I don't really need hooks. I mean, I don't really need RxJS. Like, I can just use hooks. And so I did that. And it mostly worked out pretty well. So you have this, this kind of observable built into hooks called the useEffect. And so here we have use effect is just kind of observing that input parameter that somebody's typing in. And the hard part about this for me was the debounce part. It took me a really long time to get that to work. And that's because I decided to roll my own debounce, which was probably pretty silly, but I just thought it would be kind of fun. I think it might be better if you were doing this in a production app and you were pressed for time to use maybe like a Lodash debounce. There's a lot of different options out there. I really like the RxJs one. It's super nice. Mine is not as nice, but whatever. It worked. So I just decided to go ahead and keep rolling with this experiment and try a password checking input. And we had a component like this at work where we used RxJS and Recompose. So it was kind of a similar pattern. So you had just like an input where it was listening for user inputs and giving the user positive feedback as they were typing. So as they met all of the conditions for a password, it would just kind of say, doing good, yeah, keep going, right length, yeah, you got letters and numbers in there. And it was just kind of a nice pattern. Like, you know, I know early in the web we were just like all about error messages, but I really like the positive feedback type situation. So maybe I'm just like a hippie, but whatever. So this is what I wrote, and I realized after the last talk it's maybe not even visible if you're colorblind, but my bad. So there's basically a list of all your conditions, and your submit button is it's disabled until all the conditions are met, and so that actually works pretty well. And so again, with RxJS, we when in my work application that we wrote this, we had basically just that text input was wrapped inside of an observable. And we were using regexes to check the input. It was a very kind of similar type of pattern, except that we weren't using switch map because you want to keep all the characters. But with the just hooks version, it works really nicely. And it's just hooks. There's nothing else. So you're using handlers to set state when all those conditions are met. And the one part that I found really tricky was to get the submit button to work properly, because if you kind of like backed out and went forward and backward a little bit on the password, the submit button would sometimes get stuck. And so that was kind of a fun learning. So here are my tests. They're just really simple regexes. And these are my handlers, just a lot of setting state. And this was the gotcha, was that I was trying to do this with set state, and it turned out that I needed use effect hook, because use effect will kind of kick off a new render every time something changes. So that was kind of cool. So my last example, are you guys all still breathing? So this is another kind of like classic use case for RxJS, especially when I first started learning about it, because you basically, you know, we talked about streams and how streams are kind of a stream of anything. It could be a stream of mouse locations. So here you're capturing those mouse locations. You're observing those mouse events like drag, mouse drop, all of those things that happen when somebody's dragging and dropping, and you're animating those user movements. So I just always wanted to do this, and I finally had a reason. So yeah, it was really annoying to when the dragon kept flying, so I decided to make it only fly part of the time. Anyway, so this is a very, let's see, yeah, very simple version. Oh, yeah, that was the right slide. Sorry about that. I'm bad at this clicking thing, apparently. So I actually was kind of setting out to do this with RxJS, and then I found out that there's this HTML drag and drop API, and that makes it super simple, and then just some hooks to implement the handlers. And so I'm not saying that you shouldn't like use RxJS for this, but I found out that you didn't actually need to. So I just feel like there's a lot of different ways to kind of like drop your dragons. So this really minimal, like demo-only version was less than 40 lines of code, which I think is kind of amazing. And that's all thanks to the HTML drag and drop API. So, in conclusion, today we learned about observables and streams. We learned about a few different ways to use these patterns. And we looked at some different implementations, including our surprise guest. And so that's it for me. I'd like to send out some thanks, especially my team at work. Josh Mortensen is a god. He just like makes my terrible slides and like makes them look beautiful. Even though I'm an artist, I'm bad at this kind of art. So thanks for that. Also, I'd like to thank React Rally for having me back again. This is just a very magical experience being here. At the risk of sounding like super hippy-dippy, I love this place. I also would like to thank my partner for putting up with all the stress of the past few months and all the goats. So.